So thanks again for coming. Last week I began by considering what made Martin the man that he was. A man who was certainly a product of a very influential family in Atlanta and a strongly Christian household in which he was raised, but also a man who grew and changed as he tried to fulfill his leadership role in the freedom struggle. I also talked about King's deepening understanding of the radical potential of non-violent direct action, and how King, like Gandhi, came to realize that conflict was actually an essential and vital thing that offered more opportunity for positive change than did compromise or accommodation. Focusing especially on the 1963 Birmingham campaign, I also considered whether non-violent tactics relied paradoxically on the public and violent reaction of their opponent. In the aftermath of Birmingham, King talked enthusiastically to colleagues about the potential of mass demonstrations to generate momentum for positive change. But at the same time, he admitted privately that African Americans were only prepared to use non-violent tactics as a stratagem, and they could not bring themselves to love the white man. Theirs, he said, was a military and tactical rather than a moral approach. So if people misunderstood non-violence a lot of the time, they also tended to misrepresent King's approach to black power by stressing too much that he didn't support it in the same way as Malcolm X or Stokely Carmichael did. So today I'm going to talk about the Black Power debate and explain the ways in which Martin, Malcolm and Stokely agreed, as well as the nature of their disagreements. Part of the problem is that black power is often reduced to a slogan or a symbol. When John Carlos and Tommy Smith in the centre there raised their fist in salute at the 1968 Olympic Games to indicate that their achievements were testimony to black power rather than to American athletic prowess, it was a remarkable moment. But it didn't make it easier to understand the complexities that lay behind the term. For people who want to emphasise how black power represented an alternative to Martin Luther King, the first thing to state is that there have always been disagreements inside the African American community between those who wanted to achieve racial integration and those who wanted to develop separately, and ultimately advocated creating a separate nation or a fusion of people of African descent into a Pan-Africanist union. One can find this impulse in African American leaders who called for a return to Africa, to escape the racism of white people and to reclaim their homeland. And two of the most famous are Bishop Henry Turner at the end of the 19th century and of course the great Jamaican leader Marcus Garvey. So a key part of the Black Power debate begins with the goals. There is an important difference between fostering solidarity and unity amongst people of colour in order to enable them to achieve equality in a multiracial society that's currently slanted towards white supremacy, and a vision of the future that is actually about a racially divided world in which whites and other groups cannot coexist as equals. So, if you heard the first two lectures, you know that King's religious worldview rested on the idea that human beings are all equally sacred children of God. And you heard that he came to embrace non-violent direct action because it refused to accommodate injustice, but instead organised to produce a crisis that forced society to change. At the same time, King came to realise that most of his followers had not embraced non-violence, and he had also grown increasingly frustrated by the readiness of whites to do only the minimum to address inequality and injustice. This presented him with a dilemma. On the one hand, he sensed that he could only retain African American support for non-violence if he secured gains, and on the other, he realised that white liberals would be likely to offer minimal concessions to restore order rather than achieve justice. The key thing here is that King believed that one of the most evil aspects of racism in America was the sense of powerlessness that it bred. He believed that if you felt you had no power, you were not free. When people in Montgomery forced desegregation of buses by the boycott campaign, they gained a sense of their own power. When the protesters in Birmingham created a crisis that prevented downtown businesses from functioning and scenes that deterred potential investors and alarmed federal authorities, they showed they were not powerless. When the marches in Alabama similarly created a crisis that prompted the US Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965, they showed that they could force the government to act when it didn't want to. Nevertheless, the ultimate goal of King's campaigns was to enable African Americans to achieve their rights in the United States. In the summer of 1965, racial clashes in the Watts district of Los Angeles showed that for many African Americans living in ghetto districts, King's campaigns had made no difference to their lives, which were characterized by poverty, police brutality, and social exclusion. Their reaction against this powerlessness was violence. King visited Watts after the uprising and was jeered on occasion by people who felt that his nonviolence was irrelevant to them. Against the advice of many of his advisors, he decided to develop a campaign to address ghetto poverty in 1966, and he chose Chicago as the test site. In hindsight, King believed that his Chicago campaign to end the slums was an attempt to implement what was meant by Black Power, the slogan popularised by Stokely Carmichael in June of 1966. There were many reasons why the Chicago campaign was largely seen as unsuccessful, but one important factor was a lack of unity within the movement. Ultimately, the main area where King was able to get concessions was in terms of the prospects for African Americans to purchase homes in hitherto all-white neighbourhoods, a development that would only benefit the more affluent members of the black community and not the slum dwellers that were the campaign's initial focus. In this respect, another part of the campaign was of more lasting significance. Operation Breadbasket was a program that used the economic leverage of black consumers to extract concessions from white businesses. If they did not hire and promote more African American workers, and more broadly, if they did not invest in the black community, such businesses would face economic sanctions. This program was able to secure tangible gains from certain businesses, and in Chicago it became the platform for Jesse Jackson's later career. At the same time, the Voting Rights Act had potentially opened the way for greater African American political participation, and King authorised SCLC to launch its voter registration efforts in the South. Here too, immediate results were disappointing. In many cases, there were too few African American candidates, and in other cases, there was disunity that allowed white office holders to retain control. Nevertheless, King continued to persevere in efforts to develop African American political leadership and to get out the black vote. He thus showed a commitment to black political power that mirrors his interest in black economic power. Scholars who have focused on the Black Power movement have often stressed that one of its most important elements was cultural. It instilled black pride and encouraged African American self-expression and cultural vitality. King was a product of the Black Baptist Church and was very comfortable, entirely comfortable and at home within the black community. African American colleagues remember his sense of humour and his easygoing nature, Whites who met him were struck by his reserve and formality. His SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was effectively an all-black organisation, far more so than Stokely Carmichael's Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, or the Congress of Racial Equality, known as CORE. They had allowed whites to participate more fully, and then some of them came to regret that. King had spent most of his life within African American culture, its music and its outlook, and he was entirely comfortable with the idea that black is beautiful and that African Americans had no reason to feel hindered by their heritage. What held them back was white power, and that needed to be contested. So if King was so clearly supportive of different strands of black power, economic, political, and cultural, why is he so frequently presented as an opponent of African American leaders who have become the icons of black power? People like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael. Part of the answer lies in the distinction of goals that I mentioned earlier. King wanted black power in political, economic, and cultural terms to enable a better life in America. For a significant part of his career, though by no means all of it, Malcolm did not feel that there could ever be a just interracial society because whites were irredeemable. Stokely Carmichael also felt that the goal of integration was being pursued prematurely. It was a mirage that got in the way of the more immediate and positive goal of funneling all your efforts into maximising the resources available to African Americans and other people of colour around the world. Too often, in Carmichael's view, African Americans have been persuaded to enter into a coalition with whites in ways that had exacerbated their own divisions and shifted the agenda away from what they genuinely needed. So the first part of the Black Power debate was about the ultimate destination of the movement. And for some, that was not integration, but self-determination, the achievement of independence for people of African descent, as Marcus Garvey had dreamed. Although Garvey was forced to leave the US in 1927, his followers continued to promote his ideas of self-determination. By the time Malcolm Little was born in Omaha, Nebraska, on May the 19th, 1925, Garvey had already been imprisoned by US authorities. But Malcolm's father, Earl Little, and his Grenada-born mother, Louise, remained devoted supporters of the United Negro Improvement Association, and Earl was as much a Garveyite preacher as a Baptist one. Malcolm always believed that his father's outspokenness on behalf of his beliefs was what prompted his murder. Malcolm was only 6 years old when his father was killed in Lansing, Michigan, and some scholars suggest that his later relationship with the man depicted here, Elijah Muhammad, flowed from his quest for a father figure in his life. Again, if you're intent on emphasizing the difference between Martin and Malcolm, you can begin by contrasting the affluence and security of Martin's life in Atlanta with the economic insecurity of Malcolm's. Malcolm's father never had a church of his own, and his early and violent death left his grief-stricken mother struggling to provide for 6 children. In 1938, when Malcolm was 13, his mother suffered a mental breakdown, and white authorities broke up the family, placing the children with a range of foster homes. In these circumstances, Malcolm began to spend more and more time with his half-sister Ella in the Boston area. Compared to King, therefore, Malcolm had a much more acute sense of powerlessness in the face of white authorities. They came in and broke up the family home. Malcolm had shown some academic promise in high school, but he dropped out after being told by a white teacher that his goal of being a lawyer was not realistic for a black boy. Hi. So by the age of 16, Malcolm was living in Boston and 2 years later he'd moved to Harlem. And in the bustling wartime metropolis, he got involved in gambling, racketeering, and petty crime. He took drugs, and we now know he also had to prostitute himself to pay for his lifestyle. He exaggerates in the autobiography the extent to which he was hip and cool and mixed with various famous musicians. He was declared unfit for military service by a draft board when they heard that he wanted to organise other black soldiers, give them guns and shoot some white crackers. In 1945, while King was studying at the elite Morehouse College, Malcolm moves back to Boston. After a series of burglaries, he was arrested and received a harsh penalty, 8 to 10 years, partly because he had a female accomplice, a white female accomplice. By the time King leaves Crozier Theological College, Malcolm has served 2 years of his sentence and has converted to a new religion, the Nation of Islam. Now, there had always been pockets of Islam within the African American community, but it had remained peripheral in some ways until the growth of Arab immigration in the early 20th century. Around the same time as Garvey founded the UNIA, Noble Drew Ali, pictured here, founded the Moorish Science Temple in Newark. One faction of that movement followed the mysterious figure of W.D. Fard, who founded the Nation of Islam. And when Fard mysteriously disappears in 1934, there are lots of rumours as to whether he left or whether he was murdered, one of his followers, Elijah Muhammad, took charge of the group as the messenger. And Malcolm was one of a growing number of prisoners who were attracted to his teachings. Among the core tenets of the nation was that African Americans were the lost tribe of God's chosen people. And it was part of Allah's providential plan that they should become aware of their status within the lost and found nation of Islam in preparation for the end of days, when Allah would cleanse the world of its white devils and return African Americans to their rightful place as God's chosen people. Thus, racial integration was absolutely anathema to the Nation of Islam. Like the much larger communion of African American Christian churches, the Nation of Islam provided its members with a positive sense of identity in a harsh world that repeatedly demeaned them. King's preacher ancestors had regularly preached the message, "I am somebody," to renew and strengthen their congregation's endurance. After his father's death, Malcolm's mother never again joined a mainstream church, preferring to take her children to smaller groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Seventh-day Adventists. And they all stressed that the end was nigh and that God would bring justice to his loyal followers in the final apocalypse. So one can see how Malcolm, like his brother Reginald, might be receptive to the nation's message. As Malcolm describes his religious conversion, his praying to Allah, his studying of the messenger's teachings, following the strict discipline of the nation in terms of its dietary code, its ban on intoxicants and smoking, its abhorrence of extramarital sex, one can compare his rebirth from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X to King's kitchen experience during the Montgomery bus boycott. In Malcolm's case, it included a vision of the nation's founder, W.D. Fard. When released on parole in 1952, Malcolm visited Elijah Muhammad in Chicago, and the following year he became assistant minister in Detroit and was then promoted to the more important mosque in Harlem. So this reminds us that Malcolm and Martin have similarities as well as differences, and an important similarity is that both men found the fuller sense of themselves and of their lives through religion. For both men, God challenged racism and gave them the courage to fight it. Both men believed that African Americans had a special role under a divine providence. However, King preached a Christian gospel that all men are equal in the sight of God, and even embraced a doctrine of personalism that saw God in every single man and woman, and thus required us to respect every human being. Malcolm, on the other hand, while he was in the Nation, acquired a formidable reputation for his ability to expound its key tenet that whites were utterly reprehensible. In short, they were devils with whom every relationship was tainted by greed, injustice, dishonesty, and hatred. Hence, while King felt that black power should involve the pursuit of full freedom within the United States, with African Americans demanding and enjoying all rights and opportunities, Malcolm, within the Nation, saw black power as requiring separation, almost as a health measure, to minimize the pernicious influence of whites and allow African Americans to focus exclusively on their own development and destiny. In this sense, as a spokesman for Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm placed himself in a tradition of black self-determination that linked him to the economic credo of self-reliance, evident in figures like Booker T. Washington, and of course to Marcus Garvey's vision of independent black economic development. At the same time, Malcolm, inside the Nation...
Could you repeat that last line? Could you repeat the last line? Don't make me sure. Could you repeat the last line because that phone went off? I missed it.
Sure, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So he links him to an economic credo of self-reliance, evident in earlier figures like Booker T. Washington, and of course to Marcus Garvey. At the same time, Malcolm had to accept the limits that the messenger set on political activism. During the Second World War, Elijah had been imprisoned as a conscientious objector for refusing to accept conscription, and the experience had reinforced his view that the Nation had very little to gain by attracting the authorities' attention. Given the intrinsic nature of whites, confirmed on innumerable occasions by their mistreatment of African Americans, there was nothing to be gained by seeking to negotiate or secure a place within America. It was far better to focus on the growth of the nation as a vehicle for black power in readiness for the moment when Allah would exterminate the devils. As the civil rights activism grew during the 1950s, Malcolm would face questions about what did the Nation plan to do about racial injustice, rather than just complain about it. And he was uncomfortable about doing nothing as Elijah Muhammad wanted him to do. Increasingly, he wanted to position the Nation on the side of America's rivals in the global conflict. So when Castro visits Harlem in 1960, Malcolm makes sure that he visits him. And he wants to align the Nation with the rising demands of African Americans in the early 1960s, but Elijah Muhammad does not want him to do this. A key part of Malcolm's role in the Nation was to boost recruitment, and his searing denunciation of the white abuse of peoples of colour over the centuries was a key component of that recruitment drive. In America in the 50s, the McCarthyite anti-communist witch hunt had compounded an already pretty pervasive denial of America's racial flaws in much of the nation's education system. So in textbooks in America in the 50s, slavery was still presented often as a barbaric institution civilized by the humane paternalism of kindly masters, and racial stereotyping was commonplace. It was easy, therefore, for African Americans growing up in that system to believe that they were poor through their own fault, and so it was life-changing to learn from Malcolm that they were entirely innocent and that whites had absolutely no grounds for feeling superior. At the same time, the Nation was, in a genuine sense, competing with Christian churches for loyalty. So inevitably, part of Malcolm's message was to highlight Christianity's role in the spread of white domination. So occasionally in his sermons inside the nation, Malcolm would refer to Christianity as a slave religion and reject it for what he saw as its message of weakness, meekness, and submission. By the time the nation started to receive national publicity in 1959, it was easy to see how King's church-based strategy of non-violence to achieve desegregation ran contrary to Malcolm's vision of African American liberation. As we've seen, the nation had little interest in desegregation. Malcolm told an audience of students at Howard University, that included Stokely Carmichael, that he felt their protests against the restaurants along Route 40 into Washington that refused to serve blacks was a complete waste of time. I wouldn't want to tell my child someday that I had to beg a white man to let me eat in a restaurant, he told the crowd that included sit-in demonstrators. I would rather build a restaurant, he said, and say to him, "Here is your restaurant." Like many others, Malcolm reduced non-violence to a cringing effort to win concessions by promising not to retaliate. He complained the Negro Revolution was the only one in human history expected to be non-violent. He referred to the March on Washington as a farce in Washington. And in one of his most famous speeches at a conference in Detroit in the autumn of 1963, he likened King and the other civil rights leaders to the house slaves, whose vision of progress and improvement was to remain as close to and as favoured by the plantation master as possible, because they identified with him. Malcolm saw himself and the majority of African Americans as field slaves, who needed to revolt and gain land to develop their own free lives. At the same time as he denounced the leadership and argued that they had sold out to Kennedy and the white establishment, he also urged African American unity, a goal that his angry words were not likely to help. In September 1963, segregationist bombers took the lives of 4 African American schoolgirls attending Sunday school in the 16th Street Baptist Church. Anger at this horror made many more blacks question King's violence, non-violence, and the meagre concessions it seemed to extract. Malcolm scorned Martin's tactics by likening it to a black man who has been knifed in the back by a white man and then is expected to thank him when he pulls the blade out a couple of inches. By November 1963, Malcolm was struggling to comply with Elijah Muhammad's orders to avoid overt political intervention, especially since he now knew that Elijah Muhammad, his spiritual leader, had fathered 6 children by his secretaries. After President Kennedy was assassinated on November the 22nd, Malcolm was pursued by reporters eager for a sensational soundbite, and he gave it to them. It was essentially a case of the chickens coming home to roost. Chickens coming home to roost never did make me sad. They've always made me glad, he said. He was alluding perhaps to the widely held view that Kennedy was killed because he was complicit in the murder of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo and had tried to murder Fidel Castro. This comment went well off the boundaries set by Elijah Muhammad. At a time when Americans were shaken by their president's death, Malcolm's seemingly callous exultation placed the nation in a precarious position, and Elijah Muhammad swiftly announced Malcolm's suspension. The temporary suspension soon stretched into permanent expulsion, with the rift growing to the point when close associates of the messenger, such as Louis Farrakhan, began to talk about Malcolm's apostasy, a sin worthy of death. Fueling the tensions was the sense that Malcolm was no longer the servant of the messenger, but a rival. a figure whose personal charisma made him far more the face of the movement than the reclusive and asthmatic Elijah Muhammad. But Malcolm's style had both strengths and weaknesses. Its strengths included its appeal and resonance with urban African American youth who did not see how King's campaigns had improved their lives, and whose frustration at their inability to affect the limits and constraints of their lives made them yearn for a leader who would demand and take what should have been theirs by right. The misunderstanding of nonviolence as passive and self-effacing made Malcolm's more aggressive and macho style doubly appealing. However, once his relationship with the nation was severed, Malcolm faced the challenging reality that he had no organisational base of his own, and the harsh comments about other civil rights groups and about white Americans that the media had broadcast so enthusiastically came back to haunt him as he sought new allies. When Malcolm acknowledged his break from the nation in March 1964, he knew that it might have lethal consequences, and he prudently accepted invitations to travel to Africa and to complete the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca or Hajj. In important ways, this represented a return to his Garveyite roots by embedding him in a network of essentially Pan-Africanist influences. Like Garvey, he urged African Americans to find strength in the black diaspora and to cultivate ties with their motherland. Hosted by newly independent African nations, Malcolm was able to speak out against white supremacy with enhanced confidence as a member of an international network of coloured peoples, chafing under the legacy of colonial exploitation and wary of the reality of continuing neo-imperialism. At the same time, Malcolm's visit to Mecca was as transformative of his spiritual vision as his prison cell conversion had been. In the autobiography, he recalls the moment when he saw the faithful of every race praying to Allah and completing the same rituals as the moment when he renounced the racial essentialism of the nation. At the time, he wrote to his wife about his new view of the world without race, a world without race, where Islam could provide a true framework for human unity and brotherhood. In Cairo, Malcolm attended the summit of the Organization of African Unity, and both there and in Mecca, he talked to Muslim leaders about proselytizing for Sunni Islam among African Americans on his return. So when he did return, he established two new organizations that reflected the dual impulses that had grown during his journey. The Organization of African American Unity was obviously modeled on its African namesake, and the Muslim Mosque Incorporated was the educational and religious foundation that Malcolm set up to evangelize for Sunni Islam. Manning Marable, in his recent major biography of Malcolm, explains that the two organizations found it hard to work together without Malcolm's constant oversight, since they tended to attract different people. In the Organization of African American Unity, there were secular, more secular, educated African Americans, including professional women and students, whereas the Muslim Mosque had a core of loyal supporters who had followed Malcolm from the nation and provided his bodyguard, as he was now labelled a traitor by Elijah Muhammad. This underlined one of the central challenges that faced the Black Power movement. Although the key goal of Black Power was that African Americans could and should determine their own future, its premise was that this was possible if they closed ranks and showed unity. In practice, this was hard to achieve, and Black Power leaders seemed to spend more time extolling the merits of international solidarity than generating the necessary solidarity inside their own local communities. By comparison, Black Power seemed to face a much more concerted and hostile reaction from white authorities and white people. Given his previously harsh comments about civil rights leaders when Malcolm renewed his calls for unity in 1964, he was greeted with some scepticism, especially among the more moderate civil rights groups. He did find a more receptive audience among members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee and some Congress of Racial Equality chapters. During 1964, both of these organisations were focused on independent political organising in Mississippi in a programme known as Freedom Summer. And one SNCC member who played a very full role in this effort was a young Trinidad-born activist named Stokely Carmichael. Over the course of the next year, Carmichael would develop this Mississippi model of third-party, all-black politics in other areas like Alabama. In the fall of 1964, singer Harry Belafonte funded a trip to Africa for key SNCC members, and during their travels, they repeatedly heard about Malcolm X and what a positive influence he was. A few of them actually met Malcolm in Tanzania and were impressed. In early 1965, as shown here, SNCC invited Malcolm to visit Selma to help them in efforts to register black voters. So this is often cited to illustrate how Malcolm, at the end of his life, as it turned out, had changed and become someone seeking to participate in the civil rights movement rather than largely criticising it from outside. During his visit, Malcolm told Coretta King that he did not intend to make her husband's work more difficult, but hoped instead to make a positive contribution. Nevertheless, this in no way indicated that Malcolm had accepted King's non-violent approach. After seeing King attacked by a white segregationist on television, Malcolm sent the following telegram to the head of the American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell. "This is to warn you that I am no longer held in check from fighting white supremacists by Elijah Muhammad's separatist black Muslim movement, and that if your present racist agitation against our people there in Alabama causes physical harm to Reverend King or any other black Americans who are only attempting to enjoy their rights as free human beings, that you and your Ku Klux Klan friends will be met with maximum physical retaliation from those who are not handcuffed by the disarming philosophy of nonviolence and who believe in asserting our right of self-defense by any means necessary." The public telegram affirmed his rejection of non-violence, but also fed into a widespread misunderstanding of his position in relation to armed struggle. During his career as a protest leader, Malcolm never used violence. He did not advocate terrorism or guerrilla warfare. Rather, his position was one of strident self-defense. Tragically, Malcolm, who never used violence, became one of its victims on February the 21st, 1965. Self-defense was widely embraced already in black communities across Mississippi and Alabama, where SNCC were working, and many of their organisers freely acknowledged that voter registration was only made possible in key respects by armed defence that local people provided. The public face of the movement in the 60 to 65 period may have been non-violence, but in reality the situation was much less clear-cut. Self-defence and non-violence coexisted with each other. In the aftermath of the Bloody Sunday attacks on non-violent protesters attempting to march from Selma to Montgomery, SCLC activists had worked hard at movement headquarters to calm the angry participants who wanted to retaliate against Sheriff Clark's posse and the Alabama Highway patrolmen who just brutally attacked them. As Andrew Young recalls, their arguments had to be practical and pragmatic. They asked them what weapons they had available. They had to estimate the level of casualties if gunfire from inside Brown's Chapel provoked a full-scale assault by heavily armed law enforcement. This foreshadows the debate over whether Black Power's invocation of arms ultimately rebounded by making it easier for authorities to use lethal force against its proponents. In the course of the Selma campaign, King tried to choreograph the spectacle of police brutality for the waiting media, talking up the level of brutality on display and cultivating white liberal opinion. He invited white sympathisers to participate, and Unitarian preacher James Reeb, top right there, was fatally beaten in Selma, and another white volunteer, Mrs. Viola Liuzzo, depicted with her daughter, was shot to death driving marchers home from the final rally in Montgomery. In one sense, this replicated what SNCC and CORE had tried to do in Mississippi the previous summer by using white volunteers as magnets for the press and for federal attention. 2 of the 3 volunteers murdered in Mississippi were white, and while the attention given their killing underlined the reality that white lives were seen as worth more than black ones in the eyes of America, it did make it more difficult for government and vigilante segregationists to expand their terror tactics. More importantly, perhaps for King, the broadcast scenes and news coverage from Selma induced Congress to accept the need for a Voting Rights Act. It passed in August '65, and a few weeks later, to boost voter registration, Stokely Carmichael was working in Lowndes County. There he witnessed the death of white volunteer Jonathan Daniels, an Episcopalian novice, at the hands of an outraged segregationist. Earlier, SNCC members had been incensed by the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson in the centre there, who died trying to protect his mother during the protest march. Carmichael in particular was becoming increasingly uneasy about the philosophy of non-violence in the context of this escalating violence. He felt it made him feel powerless, and the death of Daniels in particular, who was a personal friend, made him question the involvement of whites in the freedom struggle. When Carmichael was selected as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1966, it signalled several trends. The chief one was that SNCC wanted someone who had greater experience of voter registration work in black majority counties, rather than someone who'd largely worked publicising SNCC's non-violence. The people around Carmichael included many who had no faith left in white liberals or the Democratic Party. For them, the future lay in independent politics to elect African Americans to office. In Lowndes County, Alabama, SNCC helped organise a Freedom Party whose logo was the Black Panther, a striking symbol that was then taken up by a group of young militants in Oakland, California, who founded the Black Panther Party for self-defense. So it's in this context of independent organising in black majority counties that one has to understand Carmichael's use of the Black Power slogan. Used first during the march through Mississippi, the slogan resonated with African Americans who were persuaded that political engagement could transform their lives. They had desperately poor lives as seasonal labourers or sharecroppers in these plantation districts. If they elected a black sheriff, the police brutality could end. If they elected a black tax assessor, maybe the white landowners would start paying their fair share. If they elected a black school board, they could get resources for their children. So politics could be the lever that changed their economic and social conditions, but only if they had power. The larger context for this trend nationally was the war on poverty, launched by Lyndon Johnson with a specific claim that he intended to redress the disproportionate levels of poverty experienced by minority communities. One part of this war on poverty was called community action, and grew from the claim that social programs work effectively if they can secure community participation rather than simply as handouts from an impersonal bureaucracy. During the course of 1966-67, this goal of maximum feasible participation within community action ran into trouble. It was resisted by local politicians such as Mayor Richard Daley, depicted here, of Chicago, because it cut down the patronage jobs that they had to hand out in order to maintain their political power. More importantly, as US involvement in Vietnam escalated, inflation grew, and so too did the pressure for cutbacks on domestic programs. The hopes raised by the war on poverty were being destroyed by the war in Southeast Asia. Stokely Carmichael was one of the first to condemn US involvement in Vietnam in 1966, and this cemented the view that black power was not only hostile to white supremacy in the US, but militantly opposed to US imperialism abroad. In the context of the Cold War, Carmichael's open advocacy of African American draft evasion and his declarations of solidarity with the Vietnamese, with Cuba, and other countries seen as hostile to the US, cemented the official view that black power was subversive, a pro-communist program that needed to be suppressed. Carmichael's outspokenness was firmly in the tradition of Malcolm, and its core assumption was that African American leaders had to stop caring about what whites thought. They had to speak their minds in a way that expressed black anger and frustration, and concentrate on representing black opinion instead of courting white goodwill. This did represent a different approach to Martin Luther King, who had tended to avoid public statements that he calculated would be misunderstood by white America and exploited by reactionary forces in the country. Thus, although he had misgivings about Vietnam as early as 1965, he tempered his initial criticisms after they drew negative media attention. He later regretted this. Similarly, he wanted to give the war on poverty a chance, but his Chicago experiences made him increasingly doubtful that the will and the resources were actually there. By 1967, he had concluded that his tactical alliance with Lyndon Johnson, always weak, had vanished, and in April, he delivered a full-scale condemnation of US involvement in Vietnam. Inside the White House, this was interpreted as King's desperate attempt to curry favour with the militants in order to sustain his own career. In reality, King had always been far closer to the black power position than some have believed, and his experiences since 1965 had confirmed for him that the existing political structure would not tackle the systematic inequalities that had seen both the ghettos of the North and the dilapidated sharecropper communities of the South expand in the 1960s. He spent the last year of his life denouncing American militarism that was willing to spend thousands to kill a single Viet Cong guerrilla, while denying money for even such basics as good housing with adequate pest control in American cities. At the time of his death, he was working locally to try to secure collective bargaining rights for poorly paid garbage collectors in Memphis, and was organizing nationally to bring a multiracial army of the poor to Washington to live on the Mall and lobby Congress to make the war on poverty its true priority. He was proposing radical changes and was determined to use protest as the means to achieve it. Where he remained at odds with Stokely Carmichael, most of all, was that he insisted that it needed to be a non-violent protest. A secondary difference was that he wanted to give priority to organising inside the United States, as the Poor People's Campaign illustrated. By 1968, Carmichael was already more intent on travelling the world as a celebrity revolutionary, precisely the kind of charismatic leader people in SNCC had been denouncing King as being. And this is a picture of Stokely appearing with his sponsor Touré in Guinea, in Cuba with Che Guevara, and with his wife Miriam Makeba. To conclude, King believed in almost every plank of the Black Power platform in terms of political, economic and cultural empowerment. But he split from its advocates over the invocation of armed force as an instrument of policy and over the rhetoric of racial exclusion that recurred in Black Power. King was a revolutionary by 1968, but that is not how he is remembered. And at 6 o'clock, I'll explain how he's been forgotten. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Do you think that the difference between Martin Luther King, or the perceived difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, was perhaps based on their upbringing, one from a more affluent background, the other from a more dysfunctional family beginning? Do you think that influenced their perception of?
I think it certainly influenced the way in which the two developed. Clearly, by the standards of most communities, Martin Luther King is extraordinarily privileged. His family can afford to keep him in graduate school. He goes to his first degree is when he's 15. He starts his first degree, and then he has 10 years at universities, basically. And they pay for that. So the contrast between Malcolm and Martin is pretty stark at that stage. I think it affects what they look for in their spiritual journeys. Malcolm is pretty candid that one of the things that he values about religion is that it gives him some sense of control. That he really thinks that through religion, a life that is out of control for him suddenly becomes more focused, and that he's able to do things once he accepts religion that he's unable to do before he discovers it. So one of the reasons why he stays so long in the nation, despite his misgivings about it, is he genuinely believes Elijah Muhammad has saved his life. He has turned him around, and he really owes him a debt of loyalty. Martin never feels that same sense of indebtedness to another person. He feels a sense of indebtedness perhaps to God, but never to another person in the way that Malcolm does. I also think, though, that Malcolm is, in some respects, therefore, the more remarkable achievement. I mean, if you think of how difficult Malcolm's life has been and the background he comes from, his emergence as a major figure, as somebody who has the confidence to stride the world stage, is extraordinary. And he is continuing to develop right up until the end. So if most people feel a sense of what might have happened if Martin Luther King had not been murdered in 1968, there's also the key question, what might have happened if Malcolm X had not been killed in 1965? So I do think that their contrasting backgrounds explains a lot, but there also are some things that you can see the parallels, you can see ways in which they are comparable.
I've both seen, or most people think of Martin Luther King as non-violent and Malcolm X as violent in their approaches. But how much do you think that they're actually really alike?
I think the key thing about Martin Luther King that people misunderstand, and he does get it in a sense from Gandhi and Gandhian nonviolence, is about action. That time and time again, he is more frustrated and angry at the people who know that this is wrong and are not going to do anything about it. So he thinks action is noble, and he will take risks in support of that. So I think both Malcolm and Martin are in favour of action and of determination and in terms of confrontation. I think they both also have a tremendous sense of the power of words and ideas and changing people by giving them a different view of life. They're both teachers in that respect. So I think there are important similarities. I don't think Malcolm understood that the purpose of non-violence was not to make your oppressor see you as a good person. It was to make your oppressor realize that you were so determined there was absolutely nothing he could do to change you except change the situation. You were going to be a spanner in the works for as long as it took, and nothing was going to happen until things were changed. So I don't think Malcolm understood just how radical non-violence was. In a sense, Malcolm is the more American. Malcolm's the one who gets, you know, if trouble occurs, you get your gun and you sort it out. Martin, on the other hand, is this exotic who actually believes there's another way, which he's taken from Gandhi.
He actually went to jail a number of times, didn't he, Martin?
He did go to jail several times, though in some respects his leadership role meant that they were all very orchestrated and careful, those going to jails. Malcolm X has one particular incident that is much talked about in 1957, where he knows there is an incident of police brutality, and he uses the potential intimidatory power of the Fruit of Islam, the paramilitary wing of the Nation of Islam, to gather outside the police station and say, unless we get proper medical attention for the person who's been injured, and unless we get some investigation as to what your officers have done, there is going to be trouble. And at that point, he's able to use that intimidatory tactic to get damages and medical care in the first case, and then some damages for the person who's been attacked by the police force. That's the one moment when he uses the Nation of Islam militantly to address a specific injustice. But by and large, inside the nation, he's hamstrung by the fact that Elijah Muhammad is part of what's a kind of an apocalyptic sect, which says, ultimately, any day now, the whole world is going to be destroyed, all white people are going to be obliterated, and we're going to be taken up to glory. So Elijah Muhammad comes close to the old strategy of this, you'll get pie in the sky when you die, rather than I'm going to give you some pie now. So to that extent, Malcolm is de-radicalized when he's in the nation, more than Martin is.
I think it's last week, am I understanding right, you were talking about the paradox of non-violence, and that actually it had to provoke violence in order to be effective. So do you think Malcolm, he wasn't using that, whereas Martin Luther King understood the fact that if you are non-violent, but actually he wanted to provoke violence from the opposition in order to justify your position, saying, you see,
right. I mean, I think Martin only wanted to provoke the level of violence that would dramatise to everybody concerned that the situation was so manifestly unjust. This is what these people actually do. They, racism may not stamp on somebody or set dogs on somebody on a daily basis, but really that's what they're prepared to do because of what's in their heads. Expose that, and lots of people will say, actually, I don't support that. And the other side of it was to say, also, if you don't do something that makes it better, this could very rapidly go out of control. And even if you're not being threatened immediately, you could be threatened later on. So it's a kind of brinkmanship in using violence, evoking violence to the surface. The problem with armed struggle is the speed of escalation. Martin had more control over what level of violence would come out there when the Black Panthers, for example, use armed struggle as one of their kind of core things. We're going to follow the police with our armed units and make sure that they treat African Americans with respect. The problem with that is that you're walking a real knife edge of a shootout, and if a shootout occurs and you shot a police officer, you know the white establishment, the powers that be, are not going to give you a fair ride on this one. So it's very, very precarious armed struggle unless you are incredibly well organised with lots of support. So unless you're prepared to go down the guerrilla warfare route and a very long-term struggle, armed struggle is a dangerous strategy to advocate, because a lot of people get killed and you don't necessarily get what you want. Yeah.
Could you equate powerlessness with economic powerlessness? What we're trying to get at, the white deliberately kept the Afro-American poor for their own benefit. How does that tally with Haiti, with the French and the black race in Haiti?
Okay. Well, certainly there is an explanation for racial exploitation that is rooted in economics. That you can see over a longer period of history that white Europeans were able not only to exploit people of colour for their labour, mainly through the slave trade, but also then use the presence of people of colour as what Marxists would call a reserve army of labour, as an extra supply, in order to drive down the costs for all the other kinds of labour. So, in effect, the presence of poorly paid minority workers in any society is likely to drag down the wages for all workers in a way that means that employers should be able to pay less. So if that's how it works, then the economic system in America was heavily dependent on keeping African Americans as the poorest of the poor in order to keep them as a rein on wage demands for all the other groups. Now it gets slightly more complicated in the post-war period because economists start to think actually one of the purposes of having a society that grows economically is consumption. So you don't want the poorest of the poor to be as poor because they can't buy what you want to sell them. So in the post-war period, particularly in the 1960s, African Americans have become important as consumers rather than just as workers. So as a result, one of the things that the civil rights movement can use are boycotts, consumer boycotts. You can't have a bus system unless African Americans are prepared to ride it. You can't actually sell a lot of soft drinks in the ghetto unless they're prepared to buy it. You can't, in fact, there's whole ranks of businesses that are beginning to exploit African American dollars. Another approach to that, of course, is split the market. Have African American entrepreneurs, African American businesses focus on the money in the black community and keep it inside the black community. The problem with that model, potentially, is that it can be black capitalism. So, yeah, you get some African Americans who do get rich, but on the same basis as the other guys have kept workers poor. So, within Black Power, there were some people who said Black Power should be about black entrepreneurship. There were Black Power people who joined Richard Nixon in launching the Black Businesses Initiative, which actually had set-asides for certain federal licenses. And they did remarkably well out of it, but it didn't exactly reach down into the community itself. So the economics of racism are complicated, and they have been used typically to maintain the gulf between the very rich and the very poor.
So they're not doing nothing about it.
Right?
Are they doing anything about that though? It's still going on from where you're talking about.
Yeah, it's still going
So,
on.
and they do nothing about it, or
They can do all kinds of things, but they have to be able to unite in order to do it. If individuals try and do something, they tend to be ineffective.
rub you out. You just like you don't exist.
Yeah, but you've
Yeah.
got to have a group on your side. So the thing about all three, Malcolm, Martin and Stokely Carmichael, is they believed in coming together, closing ranks, organising and making a collective effort. That's how you get some change.
It was suggested that Martin Luther King was accompanying after Gandhi in his non-violent stance. But I think that was more of his about, although Gandhi might have presented a role model for the effectiveness of that. Don't you think that was more down to his religion, Martin Luther King's Christianity?
Certainly when he starts, the first thing that leads Martin Luther King to non-violence is Christianity. It's his Christian ministry. That's where he comes to first. But as he studies Gandhi, he does begin to get the sense that the most important thing about non-violence is its embrace of conflict. That conflict is a good thing. Conflict is when you are close to the truth. When you start saying there's no conflict in the world, you're lying to yourself and you're probably protecting yourself, but not others. So I think there is a point of Gandhian conversion for Martin Luther King when he, like Gandhi, says, actually, we have got to make things worse before they can get better. We have actually got to stage a crisis in order to get progress.
Yes, we could explain civil disobedience, because they're only speaking about it. It sounds like that's what you're speaking of in that movement. Could you explain civil disobedience too? It seems to be linked to what I'm hearing here.
Civil disobedience is a kind of non-violence, but technically what it means is you know the law requires you to do something and you think that law is wrong. So you deliberately go and break that law in order to dramatise the cost of doing it. So take the Vietnam War, when the law was that with selective service you could be drafted into the army. If thousands of people burnt their draft papers and refused to be drafted into the army, that's civil disobedience. The Americans could be spending almost as much money imprisoning the people who are evading the draft as they are in training them to go and fight. So the army begins to say, this war is so unpopular, we're going to have to change something.
Understand in economics too.
In economic terms, civil disobedience probably means when, in this country at the moment, there are various things you have to do before you can have a legal strike. Many people believe that the rules about what you have to do first before you can have a legal strike are set there to make sure you have as few strikes as possible. Some trade unionists think that instead of going through what the law says, you should say, we're going to have this strike, we know it's illegal, but there are so many of us that if you try and put us all in prison, we'll fill the jails.
You know, you're making a statement to say, well, look, I take over rights and all that kind of things,
Yeah. Yeah.
What was the personal relationship between the three and how did they work out those differences?
Well, Martin Luther King met Malcolm X on one occasion, and it was just, they almost bumped into each other. They'd both gone to Capitol Hill to watch the Civil Rights Act being debated. They hadn't planned it, they met, photos were taken, that was the only time they ever met. They never, as far as we know, talked to one another. Interestingly, perhaps, Malcolm had regularly invited Martin Luther King to debate with him on the radio and in person. Malcolm was a phenomenal debater. He was one of the best there is. He was as quick as could be, and he could run rings around almost everybody. very sensibly, Martin Luther King consistently said, no, I've got something else to do, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do that. So they never actually met. As I said, Stokely Carmichael got to know King quite well, and they had a good relationship privately and personally. And I think the most important thing is that King was more a critic of black power as a kind of, as a slogan, as something that you want to put out there, as the label that kind of signals your movement, because he just didn't think it helped. It didn't add anything. He felt that, and Stokely Carmichael would say to him, well, all the other ethnic groups in America have done this. Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, they've all bonded together to help each other, and that's how they've been successful. And he said, but they haven't gone around shouting about Irish power and shouting about Jewish power. They've just gone on with it. So why do we have to call ourselves the Black Power movement? Why can't we have things that achieve black power, and we don't have to say anything that then gets all the white authorities joining together to make it harder for us? So King was more almost about the marketing than about the actual substance of black power. Stokely Carmichael was a fan of Malcolm X. He'd heard him speak on a couple of occasions and thought he was an extraordinarily powerful speaker. Certainly, in terms of the teacher role that I mentioned, Stokely Carmichael wanted to be the kind of teacher that he felt Malcolm X had been, in terms of changing people's ability to see how the world operated and how they could operate in it.
Could any comparisons be taken between Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 1920s?
Which is stretching me now.
Well, I think there are some.
Yeah, I think there are some similarities. There are also some tensions. I mentioned earlier that black power can lead to black capitalism, and one of the criticisms that Du Bois certainly had about Marcus Garvey was that the UNIA, as far as he could see, was about getting more businesses going, and wasn't particularly about protecting workers' rights. So at that stage, Du Bois felt that Garvey was much more of a black capitalist, and Du Bois was already on the road that would see him become an African-American socialist. He also felt that Garvey was, in a sense, exploiting some aspects of what he thought were weaknesses within the African American community. I
was referring more towards one arguing against separation. So black community being a nation within a nation versus Du Bois' more integrationist approach.
Well, Du Bois vacillates on that. When he's not, in the 30s, he's going to be advocating black economic nationalism. So he doesn't necessarily say integration at all costs. I think in the 20s, you're right, Du Bois is far more interested in seeing how African Americans can fit into America, whereas he sees Garvey as switching the attention of African Americans back to Africa. And he thinks that could be counterproductive. But I think in terms of their influences going forward, probably Du Bois comes around more to Garvey's point of view and becomes a Pan-Africanist himself, and then also believes that the internationalization of the struggle can ultimately enable African Americans to participate more effectively inside America.
The question that you did answer
is
to do with Haiti.
Oh, the Haiti, right, okay.
Yeah, how did the American whites and the British colluded to bring Haiti down? Up to today, it's still poor.
Yeah, I mean, Haiti was French, and it was also the first independent African American nation after the slave uprising. Consequently, it faced an extraordinarily difficult beginning with nations that wanted to see it fail. It also, however, faced the classic dilemma that so many other countries faced, which is it needed to survive in a nation, in the world, by trading. It had one commodity that the world wanted, which was mainly sugar, and as a result, it became stuck in a cycle of dependency. So many countries, in order to survive in the short term, focus on producing the cash crop, and the cash crop pays the bills in the short term, but also tends to lead them into dependency on the United States or on Europe, and those ties of dependency are what have continued to keep Haiti and many other Afro-Caribbean countries and many other African countries in a situation where they're constantly paying off debt. So, effectively, Haiti is an example of the way in which developing countries are encouraged to develop through loans, and the focus of development is usually on a cash crop or some other commodity that the world wants, and afterwards the resource is gone or is not selling at the same price, and the debt has grown, and the debt is what keeps you dependent and under the thumb of the United States, in most of the Caribbean, and in Africa, the West more generally.